All right, good afternoon, everybody. I am your presenter today. Also, I am co-presenting with the big giant head over here today. So, they brought that in for a Sunday, was that a Sunday program? Something about the gentleman that made that casting. I assume it's going to stay here forever because it's too heavy to move. Now, the Great Lakes are a great place to visit. Not real nice between now and December. Terrible place, especially Lake Superior. The lakes were placed in possibly the worst possible place. When storms do form in October, November, early December, usually what happens is you get warm, moist air coming up from the Gulf of Mexico, and then you get the cold Arctic air from the Arctic Circle, and they just so happen to meet right over the Great Lakes. And that causes all kinds of problems, as we will undoubtedly see. That quote is a quote from Herman Melville's Moby Dick, talking about the Great Lakes, sailors knowing just as bad of storms as there are on the oceans. There have been several ocean captains who have decided they're going to have a sweet, simple life and go sailing on the Great Lakes, and the first storm they're through, they are done, and they return to the sea. Now, the Great Lakes contains about 22% of the world's fresh water. It's pretty well estimated 6 quadrillion gallons of water in all the 5 Great Lakes. I think quadrillion is where our country's deficit is now. So I can't really fathom how big that actually is. All 5 Great Lakes, of course, hold 80% of North America's fresh water, and like I said, 22% of the world's fresh water. Now, what would happen if you tipped all the Great Lakes up and dumped them out? You would flood North and South America in a foot of water. That's 6 quadrillion gallons. Collectively, the 5 Great Lakes cover a surface area of 94,000 square miles. This is equal to the surface area of Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Maine, the whole colonies of New England, plus the state of New York to be thrown in. Lake Superior alone by itself forms an area larger than the country of Ireland. So it is a large expanse of fresh water. Here is a cross-section cut of all the Great Lakes. If you took a big knife through the Earth's crust, and their elevation above sea level, you can see, of course, Lake Superior, so it's the biggest, and it's also the deepest at 1,300 feet. Lake Huron, about 750 feet at its lowest depth or deepest depth. Lake Michigan's 923 feet. Lake Erie is the shallowest of the Great Lakes, and its deepest point is 210 feet. And it is so shallow that several times, if the winds pick up and they come directly out of the west and they are actually moving directly west to east, they will actually push the water from the western shore of Lake Erie to Buffalo. And the depth shrinks so much that ships have to wait in Lake Huron or Lake Sinclair by Detroit and wait for the water to come back in the bathtub. So it's the same idea. Lake Ontario, 802 feet. Of course, you've got a little thing called Niagara Falls that feeds into Lake Ontario. Then you keep going downtown, you get to the St. Lawrence River, and then you get into the Atlantic Ocean. The St. Lawrence seaway is bypassed partly by part of the Welland Canal to get in there. It is a big canal with several locks, just like the Soo locks. Without the Soo locks, there would be no way to get from Lake Superior down or from the other lakes, 4 lakes up. And so those were put in to help. Now, over the past, there's about 6,000 possible shipwrecks on all the Great Lakes, but the number may be as high as 10,000. I've seen numbers as high as 12,000. We just don't know. Prior to basically the 1880s, record keeping was bad at best. Lots of ships didn't even know who was actually on board. They had no passenger lists. Some of the working ships didn't know what workers they had on there. Some workers would go to a dock, get off, and go to another ship and never inform anybody. All kinds of problems with that. There was a sailor from the UP who got on a ship and it docked and he got off and didn't tell anybody, and he went to another ship because the food was better. And he never informed anybody or wrote home that he was changing ships. Well, the ship he got off of left the dock and sank, and nobody was recovered. His parents, of course, heard about this, and they held a funeral. And he finally got to port on his new ship and figured he probably should write home. And so he did, and decided to actually go home. And I'm sure that was a great surprise, coming in on your own funeral. So possibly 30,000 lives have been lost. We'll never really know the total accurate amount, just because of the record keeping. Only about a third of the shipwrecks in the Great Lakes have been discovered. So they are all over the place. They just discovered a ship up in Lake Superior called the Western Reserve. They just found that in like August, July or August, somewhere in there. And sometimes they find ships by mistake. They're looking for something else, and oh, what's this big thing? And it turns out to be a ship they've been looking for years and years and years. The actual first kind of recorded possible shipwreck on the Great Lakes is Robert LaSalle's Griffin. Robert LaSalle, around 1678 or so, came to Buffalo, what would later be Buffalo, New York, and they built a sailing vessel from all of the trees and woods around the eastern shore of Lake Erie. They built it. The Native Americans that were there didn't know what to do with it. They thought it was a giant canoe and didn't think it would float. It did float, which they were quite amazed. Without any depth charts, maps, GPS, radar, sonar, LaSalle and his crew, along with a ship captain that he had hired, made it through Lake Erie, up past Detroit, up the St. Clair River, up into Lake Huron, through the Straits of Mackinac, and all the way down into Green Bay, just in time for a Packers game. I'm kidding, it was 1678, all right? So when they got to Green Bay, they had packed the Griffin full of furs and other things that they had stopped along the way and trapped and took. LaSalle needed those furs because he needed to pay everybody. Sailors don't sail for free. You can pacify them with food, but they still want paid. So because the ship was completely packed, LaSalle and his men decided that they were just going to take their canoes off and they were going to sail down the western shore of Lake Michigan, around the foot of Lake Michigan, and that's their trip when they discovered the outlet of the St. Joseph River, sailed upriver, got out at basically Riverview Cemetery, and walked out to the Kankakee Marsh to find the Kankakee River. So that was his trip. However, Before they left Green Bay, LaSalle told his ship captain, hey, sail back to Mackinac Island because there was fur trading posts there. There's still a fort there. Wait for me, 5 months. We'll be back. We'll cash out all the furs, divide all the money up. They watched the Griffin go out, sail over Upper Lake Michigan below the horizon line, lost sight of it. Nobody ever saw the Griffin again. Some have said possibly wrecked somewhere in the Straits. Native Americans that were in St. Ignace, which is on the north end of the Mackinac Bridge, said they saw a giant canoe in a fierce storm and they lost sight of it because the snow was so heavy. That's a possibility. It's also a possibility because the ship captain that LaSalle hired and LaSalle did not get along. And it could be that he did make it to Mackinac Island, cashed out all the furs, pocketed the money, and set the Griffin on fire and pushed it out into Upper Lake Huron. And that's always also possible. So every summer from that point on, some college underwater archaeology team has been trying to find the remains of the Griffin. They always come up with some piece of wood. Oh, this has got, it's not. 10,000 shipwrecks, possibly in the Great Lakes. Your odds are not good. Not good. So this becomes the first actual sailing vessel with sails on the Great Lakes and possibly also the first shipwreck on the Great Lakes. This is the Cypress. This is about the only picture we have of the Cypress actually sailing. It was built in Lorain, Ohio, and it was launched August 17th, 1907. She was 420 feet long and weighed 14,000 tons empty. On her second trip, just her second trip, on October 11th, 1907, the Cypress was hauling iron ore from Superior, Wisconsin on the far western end of Lake Superior. They were hauling iron ore from there to Buffalo, New York. She got out into Lake Superior, followed the southern shore a little bit, and when she was off the shore at Deer Park, Michigan, a moderate storm started up. As the Cypress traveled along across Lake Superior, she had been pelted with northwesterly waves all day. As a result, the Cypress had developed a list to port. Around 7:45 or so, the ship lurched to port and capsized and sank. Second mate Charles Pitts and two other crewmen fastened themselves to a raft, which it's only a raft in theory, not in practice. It was basically a piece of wood with some kind of barrel on it, but it was too short in the, kind of the wheelbase, and every wave that came flipped it over. By 2 a.m., they were about 300 feet from shore when a wave capsized the raft, and Pitts was the only person to actually make it to shore. He was the only survivor of a crew of 23. Eventually, all but 2 bodies were recovered. The wreck was discovered by accident in August of 2007. They were looking for another, what they call ghost ship, a ship that disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to it. Then sailors say they hear it and see it out the horizon line, this ghostly, thing going through the water. This is possibly the shortest lifespan of any freighter that's ever sailed on the Great Lakes. She made it about, 55 days, and she sank. There was another freighter, can't ever remember the name, but she had sailed for over 100 years and was still sailing when they took her off the lakes, was still seaworthy. The Henry B. Smith was also built in Lorain, Ohio, and was launched May 2nd, 1906. The Smith arrived at Marquette, Michigan on November 6, 1913, to take on a load of iron ore again. Over the next 2 days, a southwest gale swept over Lake Superior, dropping the temperature to 24 degrees in about 3 hours. Captain James Owen had been dogged with all kinds of delays and misfortunes all year sailing on the Smith. Owners of the Henry B. Smith let it be known to Captain Owen if he didn't bring this load in on time, he would be looking for another ship to guide. On November 9th, the Smith was finally loaded and it departed out into Lake Superior. Almost as soon as the ship left the harbor, a fierce wind grew, and observers from shore reported they saw the deckhands trying to secure the 32 hatch covers that make up the deck. It's hard to see them. They saw the deckhands trying to secure all 32 of those, a process which normally took hours to complete. The hatch covers are big, thick pieces of steel. They go down the open hatch. Then you've got to go back with a tool and you got to put these like C-clamps on them. And there's 100 to each. It takes hours to do. Crews hate it. But in a bad storm with this ship when it was built, to try to make it waterproof, just putting the lid on there with the C-clamps, that didn't make it watertight. After you did all that, then you had to spread out these tarps over each hole and secure those down. The crew even hated those worse. And so observers observing the crew still putting those hatches together and putting them on may lead to why it sank. Observers also noted that when the storm was in full motion, the Henry B. Smith was observed turning towards kind of a finger peninsula of Keweenaw, the Keweenaw Peninsula, trying to find a safe harbor to hold out and wait for the wind to quit blowing. They were trying to shelter. That was the last time anybody ever saw the Henry B. Smith. Debris from the ship was found 2 days later, scattered along beaches along the southern shore of Lake Superior. Only 2 bodies were ever recovered. Second cook, H.R. Haskin, was found floating 50 miles west of Whitefish Point. Third engineer, John Gallagher's skeleton was found on Isle Parisienne in the spring of 1914. The wreck of the Henry B. Smith was found in May 2013 by shipwreck hunters. The ship lies in 535 feet of water, 30 miles north of Marquette, Michigan. They have a picture of, this is above the pilot house that's enclosed beneath it. If it gets in the summer, it gets hot, captain and everybody comes up and gets some fresh air up there. And so that's why there's a wheel, ship wheel up here. Whenever they have to identify a ship, they always usually go to the stern, and the stern has the name of the ship. And it's kind of like if you want to call home port. This is the Eastland. The Eastland was a passenger ship, and they did take some freight, not anything large. Usually it had run all over Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, Lake Erie. It was then bought by a company that shuttled people from Cleveland to Sandusky, Ohio to ride all the roller coasters, all right? And back and forth, and did that for years. Then a company from St. Joseph, Michigan bought it, and they made it a steamer that went back and forth across Lake Michigan from St. Joe Harbor over to Chicago and back. And you could also charter it. You could also rent it. And they would take you to different places around the Great Lakes. On July 24th, 1915, the Eastland and 5 other passenger ships, Great Lakes passenger ships, have been rented by Western Electric of Chicago. Western Electric of Chicago was a massive, massive plant. If you had a rotary phone, hopefully looks like everybody knows what a rotary phone looks like, all right? They made all of the phones like that and other communication devices. Every year, the company would sponsor a picnic for all of their employees. They had something like 20,000 employees. And this year, 1915, they decided that they were going to load up in the Chicago River at the dock and they were going to sail over to Washington Park in Michigan City to have a picnic and ride. There was an amusement park, there was a zoo there, and they were going there. Well, the Eastland was docked in really early on the morning of the 24th. Now, the Eastland had some problems. Captains call these kind of boats cranky. They kind of wanted to roll over one side or the other. It almost, what they call turned turtle, several times in Lake Michigan, making a curve, making a turn, and the thing wants to roll over. It was a constant fight with the ballast tanks to try to equalize the ship out. It shouldn't have been built, is the problem. The company that built it had built other ships, but they had never built a passenger ship, and this was their first one. There had been modifications done. Also, you'll remember they took out, there was all mahogany wooden floors up on the top level, and there was a dancing level beneath that. Before the St. Joseph Company took it over, the previous owners had ripped all of those wooden floors out, and they had poured concrete high, which threw off the balance and the center of the ship. So it was a constant battle. On the morning of July 24th, the Eastland was in the Chicago River next to the dock. It was going to be loaded first, and people from Western Electric, employees, came with their tickets, got on the ship. They were loading 1,000 or more. Now, 1912, the Titanic had sunk, and laws came out that they had to carry enough lifeboats for every passenger. Where they put the lifeboats? Up top, threw off more of the center of balance of the ship. Loading on, loading on, loading on. People go to the port side to look out at the Chicago River. The ship starts going away from the dock. Captain's yelling at the engineers in the engine room, ballast tank, ballast tank, ballast tank, fill it up, and rights itself again. Then people were on the starboard side looking at the dock, waving to friends and throwing all the confetti and everything. And it started to lean toward the dock. And it leaned so close to the dock that an employee in the stern of the ship jumped onto the dock. But it righted itself again. Not a couple minutes later, it quietly, they said, rolled over onto its port side in the Chicago River. Now keep in mind, when this thing rolled over in 1915 in the Chicago River was Chicago's sewer. Every industry dumped all their waste in there, and almost all sewer pipes led to the Chicago River, hoping that the water would take it out into Lake Michigan. People were on the bridges between where the Eastland was docked. You've got people trapped underneath the water, inside the belly of the ship, in staterooms. You've got people that had jumped into the Chicago River. You got people on the bridge throwing things, hoping that they would float. They were throwing chicken coops, anything they could find, they were throwing out to try to get the people that were out splashing in the Chicago River, trying to help them survive. It kind of worked in theory, but the Eastland rolled over. This is the top deck of the ship. The people that did escape walked on the starboard side of the ship. Luckily, there was a tugboat available. The tugboat backed in so that they could walk to the bow, get onto the tugboat, and then back off onto the dock again. It was slippery as all get out on the side. It's wet. It's also drizzling that day. and they had to throw ash out of the coal-fired steam engine on the tug there onto so there was some grip. People were sliding down the side of the ship. You can see things floating that they've tried to throw. It was a bad day for everybody. You've got a Chicago policeman on the left that has rescued a dead child from inside the Eastland. There is also another dead child that a Chicago fireman is taking for identification. After this incident, after this accident, there weren't enough coffins in Chicago to satisfy all the death needs. 844 people died on the Eastland. That beats the amount of passengers that died on the Titanic. If you figure in the crew of the Titanic, that's what pushes the numbers up large. Not to say that the crew's not important, but as far as passenger goes, the Eastland actually killed more. It was complete chaos. They ended up taking the bodies that weren't immediately identified and they put them in the National Guard Armory in Chicago, lined them up, and then supposedly people who had family members would come through and identify their loved ones or friends or next door neighbors. Some families went completely unidentified because the whole family died in the sinking. This is inside the National Guard Armory. This building stood for a while until it was kind of remodeled and made into Harpo Studios for Oprah Winfrey. She said that she would not stay in the building in the dark. Had a lot of bad juju with it, all right? Like I said, there were funerals going on for weeks and weeks. Sears and Roebuck, help me with the big department store in Chicago. Marshall Fields, thank you. Marshall Fields shipped hundreds of delivery vehicles to be used as hearses. This is the funeral for the Sindelar family. All of the Sindelar family members died. They were from 3 years old to about 26 and held their funeral all at one time. And these are the caskets showing up at the church. They just basically roped off the first 2 rows of pews and put the coffins over the pews. Now, the owners of the Eastland never were really held accountable for this accident. They were smart and got a very good lawyer. You may have heard of him, Clarence Darrow. And they pretty much spent years just filing motions, this, that, and finally it just petered out. The Western Electric Company basically took up the relief money for family members that either had survived or they were a family of employees. They raised millions of dollars to help those employees. The Eastland was pumped out, the water was pumped out, and it was righted. Nobody bought it. Shocking. But the United States government, the United States Navy took it. They did some remodeling on it, cut a lot of the decks off, and they turned it into the USS Williamette and used it as a gunboat and a training boat during World War II at the Great Lakes Naval Academy. From the time that it was taken into the Navy, it never had another incident. After the war was over with, it was downsizing of the Navy and equipment. The Williamette was eventually cut up for scrap around 1947 or so. There is an Eastland Historical Society in Chicago. They've marked where the incident happened. and they have a little museum down there. In our exhibit, down the hallway in the glass case, there is a small token that was your ticket when the Eastland sailed from Cleveland to Sandusky, Ohio to Cedar Point. This is the Pewabic. It was 198 feet long. It was a passenger and freight carrier, carried some freight. It was built in Cleveland in 1863. It was wooden, obviously. The ship was lost on August 9th, 1865 in Lake Huron after a collision with her sister ship, the Meteor. Now, two ships owned by the same company coming towards each other back in Civil War era, early or late 1800s, would signal, and they would get real close, and they would pass mail and newspapers back and forth, just throwing them across each other's decks. It was acceptable. The Pewabic sunk in just a few minutes in 180 feet of water, and they lost 125 passengers. 50 passengers were rescued by the undamaged Meteor. When the Pewabic sank, it had a cargo of copper ingots from the 4 copper mines in the UP of Michigan. A total copper cargo weighed 200 tons. 5 divers have died trying to salvage that copper, which has now been recovered, believe it or not. You can see we have a nice wreck diver that's in the stern section of the Pewabic. These dumb things are blasted zebra mussels, the scourge of the Great Lakes. We finally allowed saltwater ships to come in to the Great Lakes system, and when they came in, one of the ships dumped its ballast tank full of all these little eggs of zebra mussels. They went everywhere, and they've covered every ship that is basically above 300-400 feet. It's a mess. Some shipwrecks are completely covered. They look like giant fur blankets with those blasted zebra mussels on. So a company went down, and they did recover all of the copper. This is the device they went down in. Evidently held up. You can see through the porthole here, and you got little sticks that you can reach out and grab stuff with from inside. So I don't know how much the 2 or 3 guys got paid, but it probably wasn't enough to go in there. But this is all the stuff they brought up from the Pewabic. This is raw iron ore before the invention of taconite pellets. They're about the size of a marble, easy to transport. Raw iron ore was just chunks, and it was just thrown into the cargo hold of the ship. So they got a decent payday, finders keepers. And you can't have a talk about shipwrecks without mentioning this small vessel, the Edmund Fitzgerald. Mainly, people know of the Great Lakes shipwrecks basically because of this one ship. Completely amazed when I go out to talk to groups about Great Lakes shipwrecks that there's that many wrecks. The Great Lakes are not an easy place to earn a living. It is not a pleasure cruise out there. In case you have never seen, this is Edmund Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald was the CEO of Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company based out of Milwaukee. Mr. Fitzgerald's dad, grandfather, and great-grandfather were all sailors on the Great Lakes. And he saw an opportunity that they could make money for their stockholders if they built a ship, had another company operate the ship, and then they get to share in the profits. And so that's what they did. They built this giant ship to haul taconite pellets from all over Lake Superior area to mainly River Rouge and Zug Island around Detroit to make automobiles with. So Mr. Fitzgerald brought it to the board that he had this idea. They thought it was a great idea. And the board wanted to name the ship Edmund Fitzgerald. He didn't want anything to do with it. He said, I will not go with any of that idea at all. I do not want the ship named after me. The board kept poking at him for a few months. And then one month they asked him to go out and get them a couple things of water. And when he came back, they had all voted and outvoted him. And so the ship was named the Edmund Fitzgerald. So hull number 301, before it was actually called the Fitzgerald, was launched at River Rouge, Michigan, July 7th, 1958. There were 15,000 people in attendance to watch this hull. The upper structure had not been put on yet. After they launch it, that's when they do that. The ship had some building technology that wasn't quite perfected at the time. They built most of the ship in modules somewhere else and then shipped it here. They do that today. It's second nature to do that. Back then, they mainly only used rivets to put things together. The Fitzgerald was also riveted as well as welded, which was a very, very new technique of putting metal together, steel together. A couple things during the launch. If you don't know, sailors are a very superstitious group of folk, all right? Mr. Fitzgerald decided to have Miss Fitzgerald break the magnum of champagne across the bow of the ship. It took her 3 times, 3 swings to break the champagne across the bow. Then it took 30 minutes to actually get the hull to roll down into the slip. Guys were underneath there hammering out wedges of huge pieces of wood to try to get it to slide. Well, it finally slid, and it slid down in the water, and the guys holding the rope must have gone to sleep, and the thing banged up against the other side and threw a torrent of water on all the people that were watching it on the opposite side, including a man who had a heart attack and died right there. 3 times, christened, man dies at the launching. Bad news, all right? Bad news. When she was launched, she was 729 feet long, 75 feet wide, and about 3 stories tall. That made her the largest man-made item ever put on the Great Lakes. Now they've got 1,018 feet ships, and that's about the largest that they can go because the Sioux locks can't hold any more. Empty, the Fitzgerald weighed 13,632 tons. It cost Northwestern Mutual Life $84 million to build. That would be almost $1 billion in today's money. The Edmund Fitzgerald made 748 round trips on the Great Lakes during her 17-year career. Typically, it took 5 days to go from Superior, Wisconsin, near Duluth, Minnesota, to either Toledo or Zug Island in Detroit and back again. She docked in Toledo so much, and she was so quick that they called her the Toledo Express. At the moment of her sinking, she had logged a little more than 1 million miles sailing on the Great Lakes. When it sank, the Fitzgerald was carrying 26,116 tons of taconite, and she was only 17 miles from the safety of Whitefish Bay. The Arthur M. Anderson had left Two Harbors, Minnesota, while the Fitzgerald had left Superior, Wisconsin, and they both crossed paths about 4 p.m. on November 9th, 1975. Both vessels were filled with taconite pellets. The Fitzgerald was heading to Zug Island in Detroit, while the Anderson was heading to Gary, Indiana, U.S. Steel. The weather was slowly turning bad, and both captains decided to stay 10 to 20 miles away from each other, but kind of shadow each other's paths. By 7 p.m., the National Weather Service issued gale warnings for all of Lake Superior. In the early morning hours of November 10th, the gale warnings were upgraded to storm warnings. I always think gale warnings sound worse then a storm warning, gale warning. So sometime after 7:15 on November 10th, 1975, something happened. Something catastrophic happened. In what would seem to be a matter of seconds, the Fitzgerald had disappeared. The Anderson, of course, was shadowing the Fitzgerald. At 7:10 p.m., a call was made to the Fitzgerald from the Anderson, warning them about a ship that was 19 miles ahead of them. The first mate in the pilot house was talking to the Fitzgerald, the Captain McSorley, and asking how he was making along in his problem. He was developing a list, and he had all of his bilge pumps running because of water coming in. And Captain McSorley's answer was, "We're holding our own," and that's the last communication from the Fitzgerald. Captain Cooper of the Anderson couldn't make any further contact with the Fitz, couldn't find her on the sonar, and he grew increasingly alarmed. Cooper called the Coast Guard at Sault Ste. Marie at the locks and reported that he had lost contact with the Fitzgerald. He received no response from the Coast Guard. It was 8:25 p.m. when the Anderson finally made contact with the Coast Guard. Captain Cooper testified later that when he expressed concerns about the Fitzgerald possibly sinking, he said the Coast Guard was unimpressed. Also, the kid answering the radio was a new recruit. Cooper waited another 10 minutes and contacted the Coast Guard again, expressing his strong belief that the Fitz was in trouble. The Coast Guard finally took Captain Cooper seriously, and at 8:40 p.m., the Sault Ste. Marie Coast Guard Station contacted their superiors in Cleveland. The Cleveland superiors directed the Coast Guard Air Station in Traverse City, Michigan, to dispatch a search aircraft, and at 9:16 p.m. advised the Canadian Rescue Center at Trenton, Ontario, that an ore freighter named the Edmund Fitzgerald had vanished on Lake Superior. Various search aircraft and ships arrived in the supposed wreck site over the next 10 hours. Flotsam from the Edmund Fitzgerald was surprisingly sparse. At 8 a.m. on November 11th, the Anderson recovered one of the Fitzgerald's lifeboats. It had been picked up 9 miles east of the Fitzgerald's actual location. One inflatable life raft was discovered by the Canadian Provincial Police on the south shore of a place called Coppermine Point. Another inflatable raft was discovered by the freighter Roger Blau. Other flotsam found from the Fitzgerald included cork life preservers, lifeboat oars, a sounding board, 2 propane tanks that were used for cooking and stored on deck, life rings covered with fuel oil, a stool, a stepladder, a boat cover that probably came off one of the lifeboats, a searchlight, and 7 pieces of scrap wood. And that's all they found. On November 14, 1975, a Lockheed P-3 spy plane was equipped with a magnetic anomaly detection unit and flew above Lake Superior at 500 feet and detected a large metal shape 530 feet down. However, it took 192 days before visual proof of the final resting place of the Edmund Fitzgerald could be proven. 2 underwater searches were attempted from November 14th to 16th, and again on November 22nd through the 25th, but Lake Superior was still too rough to conduct the searches. So between May 20th and May 28th of 1976, the following year, the Navy military love crossing, the Curve, C-U-R-V, the cable-controlled underwater recovery vehicle, a submersible, located the wreckage of the Fitzgerald and provided proof of the final resting place of the freighter and discovered it was in 2 pieces, several hundred feet apart, with taconite spilled all over the place. This was the shot that the submersible took, and you can plainly see the name, and that was the proof they needed. The Curve logged 12 dives during the photo survey, totaling about 56 hours. The survey took 43,000 feet of videotape and 895 photographs. The official and final identification of the vessel was made about 12:30 p.m. May 20th, when the television cameras picked up Edmund Fitzgerald on the side of the pilot house. The sections are about 170 feet apart from each other. Both sections are deep in mud, and mud has covered most of the deck. Even with all the footage of the wreck site and the subsequent dives to the Fitzgerald, the question still remains, what caused the sinking of the Fitzgerald? In 1995, the family of the crew, the 29 men that went down with the Fitzgerald, wanted some kind of memorial piece from the ship. And so they hired a guy who had I think they call it a Gumby suit. It's just a big diving type, old type bell, but it's all solid. He went down and cut the bell off of the pilot house, and they brought it up. They replaced it with another identical bell with all 29 crew members' names engraved in them, and welded it back in the same place. The bell was taken to Bowling Green State University. It was cleaned up. Then it was given back to Tom Farnquist, who was the director of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point, where it still resides. Last week, they took it out to the shore, and they rang it 29 times for the men on the Fitzgerald, once for all Great Lakes shipwreck victims, and one more for Gordon Lightfoot. These are two of the life rafts that were picked up. They're aluminum and stainless. This one, the rivets have been ripped from the seam. You couldn't do that with a die cutter, all right? It looks like Godzilla got this one and bit it in half. And a friend of mine sent this to me. We'll see if it...
An air and sea search is